Story 1. The events of this story still make me think back to that night, and I'm still trying to process what exactly happened. The events took place about 10 years ago from the moment I'm writing this story. My friends and I, who were 17 years old at the time, spent most of our weekends together. This habit started back in elementary school, playing video games and sleeping at each other's houses all through middle school and high school. At one point during senior year, we decided to mix things up by taking a night drive. I had a license and a car at this point, and my two friends, Robbie and Scott, joined me. My parents trusted us because, all things considered, we were good kids. The night started like most nights. Scott and Robbie showed up at the house to sleep over. We ordered some pizza, played some games, and talked about school for a bit. Shortly after 11 p.m., we decided to go for a ride just to listen to some music and exchange good old-fashioned conversation. We drove for a while, turning down roads we didn't even know existed. Before we knew it, we had been driving for several hours, and I couldn't remember the last time we saw streetlights. It was extremely dark and desolate wherever we ended up. Around 1:09 a.m., or maybe a little later, we were driving down a really eerie and poorly lit road when we approached a car on the side of the road. It wasn't just parked, it was somewhat crooked, with the hood tucked into the shrubs, as if the car had lost control and gotten into an accident. The red taillights were still giving off a soft glow on the road. Robbie suggested that we look, in case someone fell asleep at the wheel or something bad had happened. If someone had gotten into an accident, it would have taken hours for paramedics to find them. We cautiously approached the vehicle, an older red Honda Civic. We got out of our car slowly, and Robbie bravely shouted, "Hey, anybody there? Are you hurt?" There was no response. As we got closer, I shouted, "Wait!" While walking over, I started to make out figures in the back seat. Robbie shouted again with urgency, "Hey, are you okay?" Still, there was no response, no noise at all, except for the motor of my car running several feet behind us. After a moment, Robbie said, "Whatever," and approached the red car. We followed closely behind him, even though I felt something was wrong in my gut. We all were shaken with immediate fear as we went up to the window. There wasn't a person in the back seat, but hauntingly, it was a mannequin, not a real person. My first thought was, who would drive around with essentially a lifelike doll in the back seat? Admittedly, we got a good laugh out of this for a moment. Then the paranoia of the situation came back. Robbie continued to scream for help, but there was still no response. This is when I noticed that the mannequin had something in its plastic hands. It looked like a VHS tape. Without thinking, I took the tape and didn't even tell my friends until later that night. We decided to call the police, which we should have done in the first place. We reported the abandoned car, and the police asked for the license plate number. That's when we noticed there was no license plate on the car. Whoever ditched this car either didn't have plates or took them with them. All they left behind was that creepy mannequin with the old VHS tape. We made our statement, told the cops the location of the car, and left. Later that night, while talking about the incident, I told my friends about the tape. In a sort of shock, perhaps a bit upset that I didn't mention it before, they wanted to watch it right away. On the sticker in front of the tape was a plain white sticker that only said, "Watch me," written in black marker with a crudely drawn skull and bones. Despite some hesitation, we decided to watch it. I found my parents' old VCR in the crawl space and hooked it up to the TV. The tape began with about 5 seconds of a black screen and just the sound of a static tone. Then, a man came on the screen with a beard and long hair. The quality of the tape was horrible. He stared into the camera, almost as if he were staring right at us, wearing a red flannel and sitting at a table next to a workbench. He stared for 2 minutes straight, without saying a word. It was the most unsettling 2 minutes of my entire life. After those 2 minutes, he laughed and morphed that laugh into a chilling cry, all while staring directly into the lens. Finally, he said in a low, monotone voice, "This tape belongs to me, and I know you have it. I'll find it again. Then you'll be sorry." He followed this with another horrible laugh and cry combo. We fast-forwarded the tape for several minutes, and nothing else was said. Just a few laughs and the strange man staring at the camera. Finally, it cut to black and ended. After some conversation about this being a stupid situation, we decided not to give the tape to the police. I kept it, and after all these years, the tape still sits in my bookcase. I'll never watch it again, and I've never really spoken about this event until now, writing it down. I'm sure it's just some kind of stupid jokey, but to us kids, it was burned into our brains for years. I'm still kind of scared by the mental images that I witnessed that night. Every time I see a man that resembles that man from the tattoo, even after all these years, I still get that pit of the stomach feeling and am reminded of that fear and paranoia from that evening. Why did he have a mannequin in his back seat? Why did he crash his car? Why did he have a tape there? I always had a really hard time. Story 2. Focusing on schoolwork has been challenging for me due to some traumatic experiences in my life. Consequently, I often feel off and find it difficult to concentrate, even at home when it's quiet. Every little thing bothers me, and I feel like I've read the same line a million times. During my sophomore year of college, I developed a unique approach to cope with this issue. I started driving to a secluded location to do all my readings for school. Living not far from the countryside, it would take me about 20 minutes to reach a peaceful spot. I found the tranquility of nature to be soothing, providing the only way I could concentrate on my work. As my senior year approached its end, I started to panic about a crucial exam. This exam constituted 40% of my final grade, and I needed at least a 75 to pass the course. Determined to study intensely, I decided to make an adventure out of the experience. Instead of going to my usual spot, I planned to travel to a location a few hours away, hike beautiful trails, and find a quiet spot to study. I left early on a Saturday morning, arriving at my destination around 10 a.m. I spent the first part of the day hiking until approximately 2 p.m. Eventually, I found an amazing spot near the top of a steep hill, a clearing overlooking trees, with rocks where I could comfortably set up my books and computer. However, during my study session, my distracted brain became fixated on the sound of twigs snapping. It was driving me crazy, and I assumed it was an animal prancing around in the woods. Hoping to scare it away, I approached the tree line and shouted, but there was no response. As I stared through the trees, I thought I saw a silhouette of a person. Feeling something wasn't right, I packed up my things and started to walk back. As I reached the tree line, I paused. About 30 feet away stood a person, dressed in all black with something covering their face. Frozen, I watched as they turned abruptly to face me, revealing a horrifying mask with jet black eyes and wild mustard yellow hair. The person began to hum, a drawn-out groan, and moved closer. Panic set in as I realized I had to walk past them to get back to the trail. I ran, and to my surprise, they ran after me, stopping right in front of me. They laughed, resumed humming, but didn't touch me. Terrified, I sprinted around them and finally made it to my car. Although I tried calling the police, my phone service was unreliable. I drove to the nearest town to report the incident, but the police took no action since I wasn't physically harmed. I'm unsure of the person's motives, whether it was a prank, a drug-induced episode, or something more sinister. The psychological trauma from that day lingers, especially the memory of that haunting mask. Even though I was unharmed, the experience remains etched in my memory. Story 3. I had a friend with a psychotic alcoholic father. She didn't live with him. She lived in a remote coastal town. Occasionally, we would go together to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject now. One night during our visit, my friend and her dad got into a drunken blow-up, and he kicked us out of the house around midnight. We didn't have a car, so we started walking down a dirt road back to town where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I intended to call my folks, who lived about an hour and a half away, to see if they would come get us. Throughout the journey, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her broken relationship with her father. She hadn't let up by the time we reached the phone booth. Once there, she sat on the bench next to the phone while I woke my parents up. They agreed to come and get us, and I sat down on the bench for a long wait. Shortly after this, a van appeared and parked just behind the bench, about 5 meters away. Two young men were in the front seats, looking directly at us. As if that didn't make me nervous enough, the van door slid open, revealing several more young guys in the back. The place we were at was completely deserted, with no houses nearby. Just more road, no people, nowhere to run, and no one driving by. I stood up to see them better, keeping my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. They were looking back at us, talking amongst themselves quietly at first. Then they started talking more loudly, deliberately enough for us to hear, discussing pulling us into the van, taking us somewhere to harm us. My whole body quaked with terror. I couldn't take my eyes off the men, and I vividly remember the face of one of them, looking at me with no expression, like I was a thing. All this time, my drunk friend hadn't stopped sobbing to herself, and I couldn't say whether she knew the van was there or not. I knew I had to tell her about the danger, but I was so full of terror that I couldn't move or speak. That's when the most incredible thing happened. My friend's father, who had never apologized to anyone in his life and was the most stubborn person alive, appeared out of nowhere, drunk in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely this was, given his nature. He and my friend had an emotional reunion, and the whole time, my eyes were fixed on the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "We need to go," I said. We got back into the car and started heading back to my friend's dad's house. The van started up and followed us. I tried to explain to my friend's dad about the men, but he said to slow down and let them pass. They slowed down behind us, then began shouting more threats. They followed us down the dirt road and then down the driveway of my friend's father. They just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbors had holiday homes, and nobody was in that night. We all knew that if the men decided to get out of the van and carry out any of those threats, we would receive no help. Thankfully, after a very long time, the van backed out of the driveway and left. My parents came in a panic to the house when they couldn't find us at the shops. My friend's dad hid in shame, and I went back to my family's house. I've been asked if I went to the police, but I don't remember. I don't think I did. It was just a really messed up time in my life, but that incident changed me forever. I'm a very fearful person now, very overprotective of my kids. I don't want to change because I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the millions and millions of psychos out there. There I was, a live-in caretaker for a 94-year-old woman with Alzheimer's for about a year and a half. She moved into her daughter's home deep in the woods in the middle of nowhere in Washington. Marie was prone to saying weird things, like that her deceased sister, mother, and husband were in the house or outside regularly. I myself have been working with dementia patients for years, so it never really got to me or bothered me. However, Marie was terrified of those woods. She would always tell me about dangerous animals out there and how I could get lost easily, so I must always stay inside. She was also worried about her deceased mother and husband having to travel through them. This behavior wasn't worrisome given her health condition. I'd been working with her for about 6 or 7 months when I would start waking up to her walking down the halls in the middle of the night. Sundowning is fairly normal for people with Alzheimer's, so again, I wasn't troubled by any of this. She started going to a specific window and giggling like she was interacting with someone outside the window. When I asked what she was doing, she'd say, "My mother is out there." Kind of weird, but there's a different perception in her world. One night, in the dead of winter, her daughter and I were awoken to the blaring sound of the house alarm. The daughter and I checked the doors and windows, none of which seemed disturbed or unlocked. The only thing missing was Marie. She was nowhere in the house. Panicked, I rushed outside to find her while her daughter continued to search the house. No tracks anywhere, no disturbed snow, nothing. After 10 to 15 minutes of yelling and searching the woods, I started making my way back to the house where her daughter already was, in the process of calling 911. As I approached the house, I saw Marie standing outside the window she normally stood at, giggling. There weren't any footprints in the snow around her, and she wasn't cold to the touch. She was just standing there, laughing at nothing, and didn't even know she was outside. Her late-night window visits became more and more frequent after this, but less happy. she'd get combative with the window and scream at whoever she believed to be there. Then it just stopped. One day, one of the last conversations I had with Marie before she passed, she told me not to let them take me into those woods, and I hope they... Story 5. When I was 7 years old, my father took my older brother and me to a cabin in the middle of literally nowhere for a week as a vacation. We also took our cat with us. Everybody had their own room, and I had the room furthest from the other two. It was positioned right where the woods started. There was a window right next to my bed, and on the right side, there was a tree. I remembered trying to climb it the previous day without success. By the way, the bedrooms were on the second floor, and the window didn't have any curtains or blinds to cover it. One night, I remember feeling really homesick and unable to sleep. The cat was lying on the bed with me. I was reading a comic book with a flashlight, when around 2:00 a.m., I began hearing a tapping on my window. At first, I just assumed it was a tree branch tapping on the window because it was a windy night after all. That was until I began to hear whispers. I just remember freezing in fear, feeling like a bunch of ice water had just been poured on top of me. I could hear whoever it was tapping, then saying things like, "Open up, son, it's Daddy, let me in. Luke, it's cold out here." And the worst one I heard was, "Come on, it's Daddy, I just want to cuddle." I was paralyzed by fear. I just lay on my side facing away from the window, terrified, close to tears. I knew it wasn't my father, and in my imagination, I thought it was the boogeyman or some kind of other creature that would kill me. All the while my cat was hissing and clawing at this guy. I just remember holding him, burying my face into his fur because he felt like a safety net, my one defense against this guy. I couldn't work up the nerve to call for my father. Then I remember hearing this horrible screeching noise. I looked around to see what it was, and I could see this guy with the most maniacal grin that I've ever seen, like something out of a horror movie, dragging a pocket knife against the glass, making that horrendous noise. Once I found my voice, I screamed bloody murder. The grin disappeared. He looked like a combination of horrified and absolutely full of rage. But then my father came barreling into the room with his hunting rifle, and as you can imagine, seeing that made this guy panic and sort of drop backward. My father looked at me, made sure I was okay. My brother ran into the room, and then my father went off to go catch this guy, hopefully before he got away. Unfortunately, it wasn't a long drop, and the man probably only got a few bruises from it. He was definitely gone by the time my father got out there. We waited the night. Nobody slept before we packed up and went home the following day. I have no clue if they ever caught that guy, though I remember my father filing a police report and having me talk to the police to give them a description. I'm still grateful for my cat, who turns 14 this week and is still as feisty as ever, for providing me comfort during that awful, terrifying night. I was only 10 the last time that happened. Story 6. My family had gone to our cabin for a vacation we used to go every year, but after that time we stopped, which I was glad about, because something really strange happened the last time I was there. It was me, my older sister, my mother, and my father. They had all gone to sleep, and I was restless. I mean, it was early and I was 10, so I didn't know what to do with myself. I ended up making the foolish decision to sneak out and stare at the stars. We didn't get those kinds of sights in the city, so I snuck out of the cabin as quickly as I could and made my way to the fire pit. The fire had long been put out, but it was a good place to sit and overlook the feeling near the cabin and see the stars. As I sat there, I looked out into the field, and at first I couldn't tell what I was seeing. It looked like something was moving in the tree line just beyond the field. It wasn't until it stepped out into the light that I realized it was a man, and he appeared to be heading towards the woods on the other side of the field. As he made his way through the field, I could see more and more of what he was doing because of the moonlight. I noticed he was dragging something that looked heavy. My heart just about to stop, though. When I noticed he stopped moving and turned in my direction, I wasn't sure that he saw me, until I noticed he lifted his hand, and I swear he waved. I was so scared, however, to my relief, he just kept on moving. I immediately went inside and didn't say anything about it to my parents. I didn't want to get in trouble for sneaking out. It wasn't until 5 years later, when we were all sitting outside of our home, enjoying some takeout by the pool, that I ended up bringing it up. I didn't think anything of it. We had just been talking about some scary things that happened to us. so I thought it would be a good one to share, but the look on my dad's face told me that I had said something that really freaked him out. That was when he explained to me why we have never gone back to that cabin. Apparently, 2 weeks after we had left and gone home, my parents were questioned by the police, considering a body that they found near our cabin, just a few days after we had left, apparently. Upon searching the area, police found 9 different bodies buried in the property. I will absolutely never forget what I saw that night or how lucky I am still to be. Story 7. Here I was, so excited to be getting back to the cabin with my cousins. It had been a few years since I had been able to join them on their weekend hunting trips, but finally our schedules lined up and my parents let me go with them. It was just me, my 2 cousins, and their dad, my uncle. We made it to the cabin and began to unpack. The boys and I couldn't wait to get outside and run around the woods for a little while before it got dark, so that's exactly what we did. We dropped our stuff off and immediately ran outside. We were out there for about 2 hours before my uncle called us in for dinner. When we got inside, he seemed a bit weird, but I didn't think anything of it. I just sat down and got ready for some dinner. That was when my uncle asked my older cousin if he remembered leaving the door open or anything like that. He seemed to think that a squirrel or some sort of animal had gotten in and had been rummaging through whatever they had left there. My cousin said no, and that was the end of that conversation. We didn't speak another word about it. We just enjoyed our pasta and talked about our plans for the next day. All through the meal, though, I couldn't help but shake the feeling like something was looking at us again. I just brushed it off, like it was nothing, and finished eating. After a few hours, it was time for bed. My cousins and I got to stay in the living room of the cabin on the pull-out couch and the reclining chair, while my uncle slept in the room in the back of the cabin. It took a while because we didn't have a TV, but we eventually fell asleep. However, about an hour after finally passing out, I woke up to my younger cousin shaking me. When I asked him what he needed, he didn't move, but I noticed his eyes were locked onto the window. When I looked, I couldn't help but scream. On the other side of the window, I could see a full-grown man looking in at us. I yelled so loud that I startled everyone in the cabin awake, my older cousin and my uncle. It was so loud that even the man outside the window seemed shocked. My uncle came running out to ask me what happened. We explained everything, and without a second question, my uncle grabbed his cell phone and called the local police. They said they would be